Right, so we're now going to look at using a database connection within our models, which is extremely important because if you need to pull database information, your model is going to handle that. That's going to be accessed within your controller. Then within your view, you can output whatever you want. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an example table. This is going to store a couple of example users. We're then going to output them within a view. So we're going to do this from scratch. So looking at the structure of our application at the moment, all we've got is our config set up to access our database. That's really important. Make sure that's all set up and correct. We've got our home controller and an index method here. We've got no models at all at the moment, and we've just got a home view. So in the browser at the moment, this is all we see. By the end of this video, we'll have connected to a database, we're pulling information, and we'll be outputting information on this page. Although it's home, we're just going to pull, say, the latest 3 users or the latest 2 users or whatever. So let's first of all just open a connection to our database. And we're going to use the PHP MVC database that we created earlier. Now, showing tables here, we've got nothing. So let's create a table called users. Oh, sorry, we obviously need to give it some information. So I'm going to give this an ID, a username, and I don't know, created date. And for each of these, we need to give obviously the data type and etc. etc. This is going to be integer. It's not going to be null. It's going to be the primary key, and it's going to have an auto increment here, just as you would probably expect to find. A username will just give this a varchar 20, and the created at will set as a date time. So once we've done that, let's just show tables, make sure that's all in there, and let's describe the users table. Cool, so let's start inserting into this. So insert into users, we'll insert a username and a created at time, date time. So the values for this are going to be, we'll do the first one as Alex, and we'll say now. Cool, that's done. The next one will say Dale. Then we'll say Ashley, Billy, Sheba, and we'll say Tabby. Cool, so let's do a select everything from this users table, and that gives us all that information. So we've now got all this to play around with inside of models in our application. So the first thing we want to make sure that we can do is actually use a model to grab this from our database. So we don't have any models. Let's create a new model here. I'm going to call this users or user model. So inside of here, let's create a class called user. This is now our model. We now have a model that we can load into our controller to maybe output the, I don't know, last 3 users or something like that. So we obviously need a method in here to do that. Let's say latest users. So let's return 5 for now, just so we can sort of test this in here and that it's working. So we'll say users is this load model, as we saw in the last part, and let's load this model in. We'll actually call this user model. That keeps with the flow. So this should not error, perfect. And inside of index, we'll say the last in fact, we won't do that yet. We'll just output this number that we just passed down. So inside of home, we have, well, we return this from latest users. We actually need to access this now. So let's say latest users is users latest users. So to recap, we are loading the model that we created here that has one method, latest users. We're then storing what's returned from that method inside of this variable here. We can now access this latest users variable within here like that. This is going to be an object eventually. At the moment, it's just an integer just to test things out. So inside of user model, that is useless. We now need a database connection. Now, to every model that we create, we have a DB object passed down to it, or a database connection passed down to it. And this is actually using PDO. If we take a look inside of application, controller, you can see that we've got this DB property here, and we're actually setting this DB to a new PDO object with all of the relevant information. At the moment, within this skeleton PHP MVC project, only MySQL is supported in case of the config being like this, but you can change the DB type so you can support other database things. So if you wanted to use something else, you just enter it here. Anyway, inside of here we have our constructor, which is obviously run when this model or class is instantiated, and then we have an object. So what we want to do is we want to access that through an argument here, and then we want to try and make sure this connection was successful. So we're going to say this DB equals DB. So we're now setting this to a new, we're saying this property here is the DB, and then we're going to catch a PDO exception, and we'll call that E, and we will die E. Let's just pull this down again for readability. And we'll do the same here. It's really important to keep the consistency here. So we've tried this database connection and we have caught this. In fact, we can bring this up, that's fine. So let's refresh, and you can see that we don't get any errors or anything like that. However, if we were to change some things, and it might not work. So latest users, what is this going to do? Well, it's going to utilize the database connection that we've passed down. We know that that now exists in this DB. Let's do a print R here just to prove this on this DB, and refresh, and there we go, we've got a PDO object. So latest users is going to return the latest users, and let's just set this at 3. We won't bother allowing the user to choose, or the developer to choose how many they want to pull back yet. This is just a simple example. So let's say the SQL is going to be select all fields from the users table, and we want to limit this to 3. So in this case, we're only going to pull out the latest 3 users, assuming we're ordering it by created at. So let's do a order by created descending. There. So now we can either perform a query, or we can prepare this statement and execute it. It doesn't really matter what we do here, because we're not actually inputting anything to here. But if you are allowing this to be selected by a user, then you're obviously going to want to prepare this statement. We'll prepare it now anyway, just to look at this functionality. But it's important to note that what we're actually doing now with the database is we're using PDO's functionality. This is not abstracted at all within our application. We are purely, within the controller here, we are purely just passing this new PDO connection down to the model. So we just need to say query is this DB query SQL, or you could prepare the statement. So you could say this DB prepare SQL, and then you could say executed is prepared execute. And obviously with preparing and executing, you can then pass in placeholder replacements and things like that. Let's just stick with the query for now. This just makes a little bit more sense in this example. So let's create a variable called query, and we'll say query SQL. That's now selected everything. That's issued this command or this query. And now we can return query and we can fetch all of the results. So we use the fetch all method for that. So now the latest users has specifically dealt with doing this. We don't do this in the controller, not this controller, this one. We don't do this within the controller. We utilize the logic or the functionality from this model to do that for us. So now latest users will contain the object fetched here. So let's head over to here, and we can see that we've got an array to string conversion, which makes sense because we are just blindly outputting this here. But let's look at creating this in a for each loop. So remember, this is still our view, but we can do a for each loop, that's fine. It's not classed as application logic to do anything, we're just looping through a data set. So up here I could perhaps create a paragraph and say, here are the latest 3 users. Ideally, you wouldn't want to hard code this value in. You'd probably want to do a count on the result set. But again, this is an example. So we're going to do a for each loop because what's happened here is we now have an array passed down based on the fetch all method, and that contains objects within it, so we can output them in an object style. So I'm going to say for each latest users as user, and let's do a print r on user just to see that we've got the right data, and we have. So here are the latest 3 users. You can see that we've now got 3 objects here, all with the database results that we saw in our database here. So we can now do something with this. So I'm going to just wrap this in an unordered list. So for each one, we want to output, well, we can just echo it in this case because we're within a loop, li, and then within here, we can output user, username. So now when we refresh, oops, let's just tidy that. So now when we refresh, we have the latest 3 users output. So we've now looked at working with a model that utilizes the DB connection that's passed down to this model. Then we've run a query, we've passed it or we've returned it from this latest user's model, which has then been able to be used inside of our controller by loading that model in and accessing that method. And obviously we've loaded in our view, which has gone ahead and listed through that database output.